Well, everybody, you got a behind the scenes look at me fumbling around with the computer to start off this program. I'm really happy you can join us either on Zoom or tuning in on Facebook Live. And really happy to have Myron Marcotte and Lynn Ledeboer with us to tell us about Emerson Carey, a great important figure from the history of Hutchinson in this area. And I'll let Lynn and Myron, hopefully you can tell us a bit about yourselves and your background, as well as, of course, the subject matter. But real quick, I just want to run through a few things that are coming up at the library. This coming Thursday, August 20th, we have our online book discussion, and the book is The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. I'm going to moderate it, and my co-host is going to be Cheryl Wilson from KIPCOR. And Cheryl actually grew up in Tallahassee, where the book is set, so it'll be a really interesting, enlightening event, and you'd be welcome to come and just listen and learn, even if you haven't read the book yourself. And then a week from today, on the 25th at 7 p.m., we have our Fourth Tuesday photography program. This month's presenter is Kayleen Nisley, and she's going to talk about her photo project and show that she put on called From Refugee to Home. Kayleen works with Refugee Resettlement Agency and has taken a lot of really powerful photos of the refugee and immigrant experience. Then coming up the week after that, we've got the Mystery Lovers book discussion on September 2nd. And you can learn more about all this stuff on our Facebook page or on our website. So without further ado, I am glad that we got the Facebook Live going, because last time I couldn't get it to work. So that's definitely a leg up on last time. I'll turn it over to Lynn and Myron.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you all for showing up, and hope you enjoy what we've got to tell you. I'll start with a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Chicago, so I've come a great distance just to say hello. But I actually worked for the Reno County Historical Society, worked there for 12 years, although I am no longer there. But that's where I developed my love for salt, and just has been wonderful exploring the domain of salt. So I'll let Myron take it.
Yeah, I originally worked for the Carey Salt Company, later the Hutchison Salt Company, for about 38 years. And then I retired and went to work for the Reno County Historical Society. I still work for Stratica, the Underground Salt Museum. And I've been there about 7.5 years. And I have a natural love for salt, having worked in salt now for 45 years this August 11th. So we will start our little program here. And let's see, of course, where's the share? There we go. All right, so we're going to be talking about Emerson Carey, and Lynn and I wrote a book about Emerson Carey, which came out about 1.5 years ago. It's about his life, and if I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Carey Salt Company. The Carey Salt Company has been in Hutchison since 1901. They're now defunct. There is no Carey Salt Company anymore. The company got sold to North American Salt, and over time, the salt plant got shut down and torn down. But the salt mine is still going. So that's the last salt company that Emerson Carey started, which by coincidence was the very last salt company to start in Hutchinson, Kansas. And if you know any of the history of salt in Hutchinson, there was a lot of salt companies here. So this is the book, Kansas Tycoon Emerson Carey, Building an Empire from Coal, Ice, and Salt. If you don't have it and you'd like to buy it after you hear this presentation, you can get it from Amazon, or you can come to Stratica. We have a lot of books to sell yet. And so this is Emerson Carey. And when he was a young boy, the picture on the left, his father came to Kansas to seek out free land. You know, they had the land grant. What was that called, Lynn? The land
The Homestead Act.
Homestead Act, yes. Emerson was born in 1863 in Marion, Indiana. And they moved quite frequently because his father was always looking for that free 80 acres or whatever it was. But eventually his father came out to Kansas, and then he sent for his family. At that time, the family was, Emerson was the third oldest, the first boy, and the family was 10 children and the mother, Nancy, and they got an oxen-drawn wagon, headed out from there. At that time, they were in eastern Illinois, and walked to Kansas. Actually walked to Sterling because that's where Samuel was. And if you can imagine, Nancy Carey had just had that summer an infant. She just had a child, and brought that infant all the way to Kansas with 9 other children. One of the really interesting stories that we tell in the book is they were a fairly destitute family. I mean, that many mouths to feed, it would be. And so while they were coming through Missouri. They happened upon a potato farmer in Missouri, and they were getting a little desperate for some food. So Nancy stopped the wagon, and they got off, and all 10 of the kids climbed out of the wagon, and the farmer looked up, and she got this crock, and she was going to trade the crock for as many potatoes as he'd let her have. And she walked up to him and offered the crock, and he says, "Well, lady, you can keep your crock. I'll just give you as many potatoes as you'd like, having seen all these children." And that's one of the many stories of Emerson Carey that are in the book. He did eventually make it to Hutchison after living in McPherson and Halstead, and then back in McPherson, and then walked to Hutchison one day because he was fed up with farming, and got a job right away in a coal yard. And maybe most people don't realize this, but in the 1800s, 1880s, there was no natural gas. So you either burned wood or you burned coal, and the coal was all brought in by train. So there were coal yards, and they would distribute coal from those coal yards, and he got a job doing that. Well, that was just one of many things he did, and was actually his very first industry. Now, Emerson himself later got married, and he had 4 boys, and these are his boys. Well, I'm going to mess these names up, and I know it. It's from left is Charles. Is it Howard next?
Howard.
Yeah. Emerson's in the middle. Then I think it's June for Junior. They just called him June for short. And he was actually the youngest. And what's the last one's name?
Charles.
Charles? Okay.
Yeah.
I said Charles twice. I must have missed one.
Let me check.
Yeah. So those are his boys. They later took over the Carey Enterprises, which was many and vast, and we'll talk about those here in a second.
Charles, William, Howard, and Emerson.
William, yeah.
Oh, wait.
William,
Yeah.
Howard,
Charles.
okay. All right. So here is just a little synopsis of all the companies that Emerson Carey either started or was involved in. Starting first with the Carey Coal Company, that's where he started. And then after working for 2 years in the coal business, he bought with a partner, started his own coal company. Later on, he started the Carey Ice and Cold Storage because there was no refrigeration in those days. So of course everybody had ice boxes and you had to bring in ice. And he also at about the same time, and maybe sooner, started the Kansas Hide and Furs Company, where they would buy buffalo hide and furs of different kinds. Then later it was the Carey Salt Company, started in 1901. He was, like I said before, actually the last salt company to start. Used to be a trolley service in Hutchinson, and he started the interurban trolley. He didn't start it, he bought it. It was horse-drawn, and he electrified it because he also had an electric company, which we left off of this list, People's Power and Light. Later, he started the Hutchison and Northern Railway, which in a form still exists today. It runs between the mine and Cargill salt, and they transport cars between lines. So it would be like between the Santa Fe line and the Union Pacific line. And then he also owned the Hutchinson Gazette newspaper. He was president of the Kansas Soda Ash Chemical and Alkali Company. He was hired on there to fix a mess, and he did fix that mess. He was also hired on to help with the Hutchison Boxboard and Paper Company. It was a mess also. It's being mismanaged, and he got that to work. And one of the ways he got that to work was bringing the Hutchison Egg Case Filler Company, which is the little stuff that supports the eggs in a case of eggs. He actually brought that company down from Omaha and used the paper company to make egg case fillers, which was a brilliant idea and saved that company. Now, he also started the Carey Real Estate and Investment Company, and if some of you may remember the Salt City Savings and Loan, back when we used to have savings and loans. And lastly, he inherited the Fairlawn Cemetery when a person he was helping to develop that basically walked away. Now, we're going to tell our favorite stories, and one of my favorite stories, and is one I wrote about in the book, was one that's called the Fire Trap Ordinance story. And you can see this building is it's a big, what we call balloon structure building. And at the time, Carey Salt Company, this was in 1902, was the only salt company in Hutchinson city limits proper. Well, the salt company in those days was a very cutthroat business to be in because of all the salt companies that were in Hutchinson. There were, at one time, I think in 1901, there was probably 10, most of which belonged to what is called the Salt Trust. The Salt Trust was more or less headed by Joey Morton before he had Morton Salt Company. And there was one salt company called the Hutchinson, Kansas Salt Company. And it was run by a guy named Frank Vincent, who just happened to be mayor off and on for 10 years, from about 1998 to about 1908. But he was not mayor at the time that the Fire Trap Ordinance was started, although I'm sure he would know who to talk to get that started. So it was always my speculation that this was just a way for the Salt Trust to try to do away with another competitor called Carey Salt. And so the Fire Trap Ordinance basically banned balloon structure buildings like barns, like this building you see here. And here's the Carey Salt Company, which is at B and Main, between B and C on Main Street, about the place, about where there's an old Dillon store there, which is now the Salvation Army thrift store, about in that area. And you can see those big balloon structure buildings. And basically what it said was you cannot build that type of building because they can't put it out if there is a fire. Because in those days, the fire department was basically a hand-driven pump and bucket brigades. So they couldn't put out big fires very easily. So they thought, well, we'll just pass this ordinance. Well, when they passed the ordinance, there was a couple of structures being built already. One was a really big barn on Main Street. And the city said, well, since you're already building this big barn, you can just go ahead and finish it. Well, that sent a message to everybody in Hutchinson that said, if you are currently working on a building project, then you can continue it. Well, Emerson Carey had been building the Carey Salt Company and adding buildings. You can see the buildings go way down. They went down for about a block and a half. He was constantly adding on and building buildings. So he just decided to go ahead and keep building. The city said, no, you can't do that. They issued a warrant for his arrest. He was arrested. He was put in jail. He bonded out for $25, which in 1902 was quite a bit of money. He kept bonding out. They kept arresting him over and over and over again, to the point that the Hutchinson News wrote an article about it. And the article stated that if that kept going, in about a year, he would pay $9,000 to add one room to his building. But that didn't deter Emerson Carey, because basically nothing deterred Emerson Carey. And he kept building and kept building. And the amazing part of this story is that, to me, is that it said in the article that I read in the Hutchinson News that the city grew tired and gave up, which is amazing to me, because nowadays the city would never give up. You always lose in a battle with the city, and at least I always have. So, like I said, the Salt Trust, we think, or at least I think, was behind this through Frank Vincent. Well, shortly after this all happened, and they realized that they couldn't stop him this way, Frank Vincent showed up at Emerson Carey's office, and he said, look, Carey, I'm going to do you a big favor, and I'm going to buy the Carey Salt Company from you for way more than it's worth, and you're going to sell it to me, or you're going to regret it. You're going to regret it because I have 50,000 barrels of salt, and I will flood the market with that 50,000 barrels of salt, and drive you out of business. And this is by far my favorite quote from Emerson Carey, and we have a lot of quotes on him in the book. He looked at Frank Vincent and he said, sir, do your worst. I have seen a fly make a bull waggle his tail. I have seen the little guy make the big guy move. And they said, all right, have it your way. And they flooded the market with that 50,000 barrels of salt. They lowered the price of salt. It was, I think, 98 cents a barrel or something, which seems extremely cheap to me, to as low as 45 cents a barrel. It said Carey was selling salt as cheap as 45 cents a barrel. And Emerson said, they didn't understand. At this time, Emerson had the Carey Salt Company, which was his third company. He still had the Carey Coal Company. He still had Kansas Hides and Furs, and he had the Carey Ice Company, which I think at that time was called Kansas Ice and Cold Storage. And all those companies together were kind of supporting each other. And he said, I never lost a dollar in that whole venture. Yeah, I was selling salt for less than it cost me to make it, but overall, my company made money. They didn't realize how hooked up we were, was his statement. And that is one of the amazing things about him. He knew if he stuck with something long enough and outlasted somebody long enough, he would win. And he almost always did. Second thing I'd like to talk about is cars, because I really like cars. And Emerson Carey was a car nut, and he was a speeder. He liked to race his cars. Well, this white steamer, 1907, was the very first car he ever owned. It was the first steamer in Hutchinson. And the white steamer was a very prestigious vehicle. The President of the United States, Roosevelt, which would have been Teddy Roosevelt, had one. Now, he was scared to death of the thing, but he had one. And Emerson drove that thing around, and he would have been very familiar with steam because, of course, all his industries were powered by steam. His ice plant was powered by steam. His electric plant was powered by steam. His salt company was powered by steam. So steam wouldn't have been anything. He would have understood steam very well. Well, he understood steam fairly well, but he didn't understand possibly the workings of this white steamer because one day he left the fuel on and actually blew it up and blew the lid right off, the hood right off of it. He wasn't hurt. Nobody else was hurt, but that's what happened to the steamer. So he bought another car. He bought a Winton. And I'm sure everybody's heard of a Winton. Actually, nobody's heard of one because they weren't super popular, but they were one of the very first vehicles mass-produced, or it wasn't really mass-produced. They were built by hand, every one of them, before Ford developed his techniques. And I looked up this car, and I did a lot of research on Wintons because I wanted to understand them. And I could not, we're calling this a 1909, but what I found out looking at this car and examining all the Wintons, this one has the front fenders of a 1910 Winton and the back fenders of a 1908 Winton. So I'm assuming that this was a mid-year model, and we'll call it the 1909, even though it wasn't any difference. And this is sitting on Main Street in Hutchinson, 1000 block of North Main. I think Eagle Radio's there right now. No, wait a minute. That'd be the next block, 2 blocks down. And the house was a house he built. Excuse me. And he later had to sell that house. He was forced to sell that house to stay out of bankruptcy. So that's the Winton. The next one is the Pierce Arrow. He had this in about 1912. Story behind the Pierce Arrow, he loved the speed. And the Pierce Arrow was a speedster. And one day he was with a gentleman, and I think it was when he was running for Senate, or he was already a state senator. And he was speeding up and down the roads and probably showing off a little bit for a guy. And Mr. Milligan had stopped by the side of the road to have lunch with his family. Now, okay, maybe roads weren't as busy back then, but that seems like a stupid place to stop and have your family run around. And he had a small boy. The boy had a dog. It's kind of a sad story. I love dogs. And he heard, Milligan heard this rump noise, and he looked down the road, and he saw this Pierce Arrow speeding down the road. He grabbed his son. He couldn't grab the dog in time. The poor dog got hit. Milligan got really mad, jumped in his car, which, by the way, had 100 horsepower. Didn't say the model, because the newspapers in those days were really good at leaving out a lot of detail, especially when they were trying to trash somebody like Emerson Carey because of the politics. And he chased down Carey and gave him an earful. And Carey said, honestly, I did not see the dog at all, or I would have tried to miss it or stopped or something. And I'm sure that was the truth, because Emerson always tried to do as Lincoln would have done. He was inspired by Lincoln. And so I'm sure he would tell the truth when he had to. The last car I want to talk about is called the Marmon. And it's like, It was a prestigious car. It looks kind of fancy when you look at it. And he bought one, but here's the interesting thing. The very first Indianapolis 500 open wheel race was won by a Marmon, and that made their name. Now, you know, they probably couldn't compete with Chevy and Dodge and Ford and some of the others. There was a lot of competition. You know, Hutchison had his own car company called the Sellers for a while. There's a few of those around. And so he owned a Marmon. Not a lot more to say about the Marmon except for that it was a prestigious car, and as you can tell, lady in the fancy dress and the guy with the hat on. Of course, I think everybody kind of dressed that way back then if they weren't digging ditches. And the last thing is, this is kind of a joint thing between me and Lynn here. This is a map. These are called fire maps. There were a lot of fire maps of just about every city back in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. And this is one that shows the Carey Salt Company, and I wanted to show you some more of the, I don't know if I found my mouse. Carey Salt Company's long here. These would be the fire trap buildings. And the beach, which was owned by Carey, which is a pond with bathhouses. It only went for a little while, a year or two. And the county courthouse and jail. Now, the interesting thing about the county courthouse is the county courthouse was across the street. It was a wood frame structure. It burnt to the ground, as most courthouses did in those days. And they built a new fancy brick one there. It was a really nice building. And you can see it in that one picture of the Carey Salt Company over in the corner. Well, over time, the foundation, after about 18, 20 years, started to crack. Well, the Carey Salt Company's right there, right? And what do salt companies do? They put down wells in Hutchinson down to the salt structure, 650 feet down. They pump water down, they dissolve the salt out, and that leaves a void. Well, there were salt wells all along this alleyway, and the city offices right now are right in here in Hutchison, and there were brine wells. You can still see them in the alley clear back in the 1980s. You can still see them. They have pulled them all or done something with them after the big gas explosion here in Hutch. They tried to do something about all those wells. They were everywhere. And so there was one right here in this area, and the county said that the well was sinking, and that caused the courthouse to start crack. Well, it cracked so bad that they eventually had to, they eventually demolished the building, but they had to get out of it. And for a while, the city or the county was all over the place until they built the existing courthouse, the Art Deco one, which Carey actually ended up buying the courthouse. But the county sued Emerson Carey because they claimed that the brine well was causing the courthouse to sink. Well, Emerson Carey actually won that. He was apparently able to prove that it was actually a poor foundation and that caused the cracking in the building. And interestingly enough, like I said before, Dillon's was on that corner for years, and the Salvation Army's still in that same Dillon's building, and it's fine. It always has been fine. So apparently the county was wrong. And that's all I'm going to say for now. I think we're planning to take questions at the end of Lynn's presentation. And Lynn, you can take it away.
All right, well, I'm going to take it right from here and talk a little bit. I'm going to focus mostly on Emerson Carey's nature, his personality, kind of what some of those driving forces were that caused him to be so successful. Some of the things we found out is that he was incredibly frugal. He was very, very efficient, incredibly resourceful. And the beach, as you see here, is actually a good example of that. Because as he sunk the well for his salt brine operation, that excess water had to go somewhere, so it went into the beach. And it was just an example of him sort of giving back to the community, but also finding a way to do something with that excess water. And it wasn't just a little puddle pond, it was actually, you know, it had actual concrete, not concrete, but actual established bathhouses, as you see there. So it's just, that's kind of the first example of how he utilized everything within his companies, and nothing went to waste. Myron, if you'd go ahead. This is a slide just showing this is the Carey Park. This was land that he owned as well. This is showing a little bit of another side of his nature, showing how he was very community minded. He gave, I think it was about 210 acres to the city to establish this wonderful park, which is one of his lasting legacies. I'll let you go ahead, Myron, unless you've got something to add about that. Okay, he lived in this particular home, which once he moved out, he donated the house, which became the Women's Civic Center. So another example of his community mindedness, thinking always about the community, and that was it was recently a building torn down. I can't recall offhand what year that was torn down, but unfortunately it was made into a parking lot for the Hutchinson Public Library. All right, if you want to go ahead. So this is an early photo of the Carey Bar Coal Company. And I'm showing you this little office, which was in the coal yard, to illustrate just how frugal Carey actually was. Early on, one of Carey's first jobs that he got around 1882 was working for a man named Marshall Hale. And Mr. Hale did not trust banks. So Mr. Hale kept all of his money in a pocketbook. Well, one of Emerson Carey's jobs was to hang on to that pocketbook. And wouldn't you know it, Carey lost the money. It had 60 whole dollars in it. And that $60 was quite a bit of money back in 1882. And to give you an indication of Carey's his integrity and his frugalness, on his very little meager salary that he earned from Mr. Hale, he was able to pay every single cent back to Mr. Hale. He was also able to send a little bit back to his family out of his meager earnings, but the way he did it was by actually sleeping in the coal office at the time, which would have been very similar to this coal office. So it's a really good indication just about how frugal he was, which was real typical of industrial tycoons at the time. And just the fact that he was able to scrimp and save in order to repay what he lost. Let's go ahead, Myron. This slide shows how now the salt company has actually taken top billing, as you see. The coal company's kind of dropped down in significance just a little bit. The Kansas Hide Company has also dropped down in significance, while the Carey Salt Company has kind of risen to the top right here. And what I wanted to indicate here was how he's showing once again how he wasted nothing. Because here what he did was he began using waste steam from like ice compressors and waste steam. He used that to heat his salt pans that were used to evaporate the salt brine into salt. So nothing was wasted. All of his companies used waste products or byproducts to fuel the other companies. And so it was just that constant reuse of byproducts and waste that allowed him to remain frugal and resourceful to create really successful enterprises. Myron, go ahead. Here's another good photograph that indicates if you look at that wagon, you'll notice that it says ICE, but you'll also notice that it says the Carey Coal Company on it. So already he's showing that that wagon was used for two different companies. Brought you your ice, but it also brought you your coal. So he was very resourceful in the fact that he utilized both. He utilized his equipment, he utilized his resources for both companies, just kind of indicating again his those multiple uses, his frugal nature, that type of thing. It's very likely that he also used waste coal from his coal operations, the small pieces that couldn't be sold, to fire boilers that generated steam to make ice. He was probably also using waste mechanical energy to power the electricity in his plants. So nothing was wasted. He utilized all kinds of waste and byproducts to help fuel his other companies. Myron, go ahead. Right now we're seeing just the expansion of his ice operation, his refrigeration operation, also his venture into new technologies. As Myron indicated with his love of vehicles, his love of fast cars, this is a good slide showing you the transition of horse and buggy wagons, or wagons, horse-drawn wagons to deliver the ice, all the way up into those newfangled modern engine-powered vehicles there to deliver the ice. And that is another thing that Emerson Carey was really noted for, was his entry into new technologies. So that's kind of why I wanted to include this particular slide, just to show you how the ice industry had advanced and his love of new technology. You want to go ahead, Myron? So Emerson is very successful at this point. This is his headquarters. This was built in 1916. He designed and built this building that still stands today at the corner of Avenue B and Poplar in Hutchinson. This building, as you can see here, may have seemed a little extravagant for him being so I'm trying to indicate how frugal he was, but there's a reason for that, and Myron, I'll let you go ahead. Yeah, go ahead for the next one.
Oh, next slide. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
So that office building was actually sold back in 2004. A couple purchased that building, and they went through and they renovated it entirely. And sadly, a couple years later, there was a large storm that destroyed and damaged much of the new renovation. And the repairs to the renovation required that the ceiling joists be pulled out. And at that point, what they found in the ceiling joists were these wooden pieces from Carey Lilly table salt crates. So these pieces of wood that had been used in crates that contained table salts were actually used in the construction of that fancy headquarters office building. And I think this is just so indicative of Emerson Carey's frugal nature. He did not waste anything. He reused everything. He had incredibly efficient operations because of that, and his resourceful nature. He was kind of one of the original, no waste, reuse, recycle, and reduce. And so I really wanted to include that because I thought that was quite indicative of what his nature was, very frugal. And that is how he became, that is one of the things that led to his great success. And I think that may be it, Myron, is it? Yeah. So we hope we've given you a little bit indication of what Emerson Carey was like, and some of the companies that he was successful with. And we hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, we'd be glad to answer them.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Everyone, you can unmute yourself if you want to speak a question out loud. There's a little microphone symbol in the lower left of your Zoom interface if you want to unmute yourself. just feel free to do that and jump in with a question. You can also type in the chat, and people watching on Facebook, you can also type in the chat if you've got a question. I'll kick things off. You know, you talk about him being so frugal. I wonder how does that translate into he must have eventually had a pretty big labor force. Do you have any information about what he was like as a boss, whether he was pretty tight-fisted with his employees, or you know, what about that?
Well, from all indications, he was a good boss. From all indications, he created kind of a family atmosphere. I think Myron has some more anecdotal stories about that, just handed down from working at the salt mine. So I'll let Myron talk to that.
Yeah, well, I started in 1975 for the Carey Salt Company, and they were still, the old timers were still talking about working for Emerson Carey at that time. And they had, some of them had either worked for him or worked with people that worked for him. But his sons, Howard and Howard Jr., Jake, were just like him. And so not only were they great people to work for, they always had Christmas dinners for the employees. We had several Christmas dinners when I was there. They would give them Christmas turkeys, hams, that kind of thing. And the frugality was handed down too, because the Carey Salt Company, when I worked for them, produced their own power from waste steam, and also heated the plant and evaporated salt with that steam. Heated the plant, and on Carey Boulevard there was fairly new offices that were built in the 50s. That was heated by the excess steam too. So frugality was a normal Carey thing to do.
You've talked, both of you, a lot about how successful he was, how good he was at making money, and yet you shared one photo there of a house he had to sell because he was having to deal with bankruptcy.
Right.
Can you talk about that
Sure.
Contradiction in success and also bankruptcy?
Sure, and the book explains it very well, and I'll summarize it a little bit. Kansas had a land rush, like everybody, like every land boom in the 1880s, and Carey, like so many others, bought into that land boom, and some land was going for, you know, as much as $1,000 an acre, which was tremendous in those times. And the Carey himself kind of blamed this a little bit on his banker. I'm not sure who the banker was, but he said that he had the money to pay off a loan he had, and the banker said, you know, why don't you reinvest that money instead of paying off the loan? So he reinvests the money. Well, land values dropped to absolutely nothing quickly, and the bubble burst, in other words. And so a lot of people were left holding the bill. And of course, the banks were calling in the loans, you know, because they needed the money. So Carey, instead of going bankrupt, he started selling off everything he could sell off to keep his coal company, because that's all he had at that time. And even though you could not lose your house to bankruptcy, Carey decided to sell his house to pay off his debt. So he sold his house, that house on Main Street, probably sold off all his cars, and he rented a house on West 11th. And I think I read today, kind of looking at all this again, he rented it for $6.75 a month, which is like unbelievably cheap, but a lot of money then, right? And so he was able to pay all his debts off and didn't file bankruptcy, or didn't go bankrupt, and that went for him, that went a long ways with people in this community because he was able to do that. So even though he had to sell that house off, and of course later he built Willowbrook, which was his private mansion and a private golf course, 18-hole golf course. I think he was the first one in the state to have a private golf course. I don't know if anybody has a private golf course anymore, but he had one. And Willowbrook's now a town in his own, after his family convinced him to start selling off properties and letting friends and relatives build there. But that's why he had to sell that house, and that's why that happened.
And he certainly wasn't successful in every enterprise that he went into. That is really one of the times when he wasn't as financially successful as being so overextended. Another one that he couldn't really succeed with was the Gazette. When he took over the Gazette, he discovered that he was not a newspaper man. That didn't work out very well for him, and so that was one of the few, I would say, not as successful ventures that he got into was the Gazette.
And the soda ash plant, they hired him on to the soda ash plant and made him president, even though he wouldn't invest money in it because he didn't think it would ever work. And he was right. And they wanted him to save it because the whole community had money in that. And several communities, Newton, McPherson, Sterling, they people in those cities had money in it. A lot of people had money in it. And it was a big operation. It employed like 400 people, I believe. It was huge. And so he became president, and he did manage to save it. But what he did was he ended up selling it to the Solvay company, who was the big producer of soda ash in the United States. And they were very good at producing soda ash, whereas the Hutchinson soda ash company was very bad at producing soda ash. And by selling it off, that saved the company. And he was able to sell it off where everybody got their money back. They didn't make a bunch of money on it, but they did not lose a bunch of money, he was actually kind of proud of being able to do that. And soda ash why is it not here no more? Well, soda ash is a natural occurring chemical called trona, and it's in Wyoming. They mine trona up there, and trona is soda ash. So it's a evaporate like salt, but a little bit different.
What's it used for?
Make explosives, make glass. They put it in soap. They put it in a lot of things.
And the reason it was so, it was because it was right around World War I at the time. So they were hoping to capitalize on using it in explosives for the First World War.
So I'm wondering, was Carey's salt company, was this the first salt company in Hutchinson, or
No.
How did that industry, was he involved in identifying the potential of the salt deposits under Hutchinson, or?
No.
Nope.
Actually, no. It was actually the very last salt company in Hutchinson. So they started in 1901. Salt started in 1887. Ben Blanchard was a Santa Fe agent who developed South Hutchinson, Kansas. He was drilling for oil because he thought, wow, if I find oil, I can really sell South Hutchinson. And of course, he was not successful in finding oil, but he was close. But he did discover salt. And 1887, the first salt company, which is still going, is called Cargill Salt, was Borton Salt. Before that was Humphrey Gunther or something like that. That salt company, Morton Salt Company, and the salt mine are the three salt companies from that time period that still exist out of, I think when you count the whole number, there's like 15 salt companies that existed at one time, 1880s, 1890s. So he was the last one to get on board. which was probably the smart thing to do. And like I said earlier, he was able to produce salt at a cheaper rate because of the frugality and sharing steam between all his companies.
Wow, cool.
You talked about one of his companies he owned was Hutchinson or Urban. Was that completely independent, or was it part of the Ark Valley Interurban that ran between Wichita and Newton and on out to Hutch?
Lynn, you know that one?
Well, it connected up to the Ark Valley, but
Yeah, they were all connected. Yeah.
I think it was independent of the Ark Valley. I don't, it was, I know there was some discussion about how they were utilizing, the Interurban was utilizing the Ark Valley's lines, the tracks.
Yeah.
But I believe it was independent. And, originally it was through the city, the city was trying to get it established, and the people they were contracting with were just not successful in getting the Interurban up and running. And again, this was another case where Emerson ended up coming in and was able to get the Interurban up and running and making it a viable transportation, company.
The interestingly enough, the Ark Valley legacy bit the mine as early as 2010. Was what had happened was, of course, the Ark Valley was linked to the Hutchison Northern Railroad, which was linked to the Hutchison Interurban. And so the Ark Valley, when it would come into Hutch at his station, which is still there, the station's at, what street is that on? Third? No.
Third.
Yeah. So a little brown brick building is still there. There was the Ark Valley Depot. So they all used the same lines. Well, the Ark Valley went away, as we all know. Tore out all the lines up to the mine, because from that point into Hutchinson was the H&N Railroad, which was owned by Carey. And of course, Carey Salt went out of business. They got bought out, and the company that bought them didn't want the H&N, so they sold it off to a company. I'm not going to mention their names because of lawsuits, but a company owns it now. And somebody was looking at maps and figured out that a little corner of the mine property that the tracks ran through was where they happened to build their rail link into Santa Fe from the mine, and it crossed that little piece of property. And so a lawsuit incurred and was fought between the mine and this little railroad. Which is the mine's fault. They should have bought the H&N Railroad, and they didn't do it, which was a huge mistake on their part. But so that Ark Valley thing did come back and bite the mine later on. So yeah, they were all linked. They were all independently owned by, Carey did happen to own two of them. And then he sold electricity to the Ark Valley from the Hutchinson end. Because it was an electric trolley railroad. And I think there was, I remember reading about that. Wichita sold electricity. I think Newton sold electricity to them too.
Yes.
To power their railroads. Any more questions?
I guess you want to say a little bit about Stratica, since what's happening there since you work there. And
yeah, I work for Stratica, the Underground Salt Museum. If you've never been there, we are open. We've been open since June 1st. You have to wear a mask if you come to Stratica. We take a lot of precaution. We do a lot of cleaning because of this COVID thing. But as far as we know, there have been no outbreaks or no exposure. and we're still getting people from all over the country, so that's kind of a shock, but whatever. We have canceled all of our events for this year, so Murder in the Mine dinner theaters are not occurring this year, nor are the 5K run or the Tour de Salt bicycle ride underground. But we do have tours on a daily basis, and if you've never been to Stratica, you ought to come out sometime. It's really cool to go 650 feet underground. It's a really big thrill to a lot of people because most people will never make it that deep into the earth in their whole lifetime. It scares some people, a few, but for the most part, it's a great experience. Our Google Business, our TripAdvisor scores are all 4.8 or better. Everybody just absolutely loves us. So if you get a chance, come out and see us and support us. We like everybody, are definitely struggling. We're running at about 58% of what would be normal for this time of year, and all summer has kind of been that way. Or wait till the COVID thing is over. It'll be over hopefully by this time next year, and then we can get back to normal, whatever that was.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? Well, and normally this would be in person, and you would probably have some books to sign and to sell. So
yes. Well, if you want books signed, if you come out to Stratica and buy a book, I'll sign it. And if you really want Lynn to sign it, I'll take it to her and she'll sign it.
yeah, so that'd be great. You can buy them at Stratica. You can buy them on Amazon or on the History Press website, I think. And we also have a copy you can check out from the library, and the ebook is on Hoopla, which you can access with your library card as well. So I haven't had a chance to read it all yet, but I sure will. I've got it borrowed on Hoopla, so I'm gonna read some more about Emerson Carey for sure. And I guess with that, we'll conclude the program. Thanks again, you two, and everybody have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for cheering.
Thank you.
All right, great. Well, I ended the live stream, so it's just us now. But so I'll just sign it off. The rest of you, thank you so much for coming, and just watch your emails and Facebook, and really appreciate everybody participating in the library stuff. So
Yeah, how many did you have finally, Sam? Do you know?
Well, we had 11 on Zoom, and then it seemed like it was there were a handful of people on Facebook too. I was able to get the stream going after about 5 or 6 minutes in, so it was streaming on Facebook.
Yeah.
So that that's pretty good, and I'm sure some more people will watch it later because it'll be I'll get the full video, including the beginning part, posted tomorrow, and we always have people watch it on their own time later. So.
And there's some debates on TV now or whatever, or not debates, but political stuff's going on right now.
Right. And our library folks are a civically engaged bunch, so I'm sure
yes,
are watching those conventions.
Convention. Yeah.
Yeah.
Myron, could I ask a question before you sign off?
Sure.
On the salt mines where different companies and organizations store their records there, how difficult or easy is it to get those records?
Oh, it's real easy if you own them. Underground Vaults and Storage, they recently changed their name. They're now called UV&S because they're an international company now. They have a record center in England now. They started in Hutchinson at the salt mine in 1959. And they have been operating since. They take up quite a bit of area underground, but maybe, I don't know, a 20th of the mine or less. It's not very much of the mine totally, but they do take up quite a bit of area. And Stratica actually rents from Underground Vaults and Storage, which rents from the mine. That sounds complicated, but that's how they worked it out. And we jointly own the shaft that we put down for Stratica. We put that down in 2005. And so both UVNS and Reno County Historical Society both own that, well, and pay for it and maintain it. But yeah, they can send up, you call for a record. Most of the time, of course, all the records are going electronic now. What they store the most of is movie films. That's really what their bread and butter is. And they store a lot of movie films. And it's simply because in Hutchinson, Kansas, it costs $2 and I don't know, say $2.50 a cubic foot a year to store boxes of movie film, where in California, it was like $200 a cubic foot a year.
Wow.
For many reasons, it was on the surface and everything's expensive in California. And so they send all their films out. All the big production companies are here in Hutchinson. Underground Vaults also has a place in the limestone mines in Kansas City. They do store films up there also. But all kinds of records. The big petroleum companies all store magnetic media here, and courthouses all store, all the county courthouses in Kansas store something here at the mine. A lot of it's old paper that they don't want to mess with. They don't want to digitize, but they also, for one reason or another, don't want to destroy it. And so, right now there's a very big server farm underground that Underground Vaults of Storage actually backs up the backup companies. So, you see these big companies that advertise, back up your computer with them. Well, Underground Vaults of Storage backs them up. So that stuff gets backed up a lot. So
Everything is barcoded, isn't it, Myron?
yeah, everything in a box is barcoded, and there's a position. Every position is barcoded on shelving underground. They have 120 300-foot by 50-foot bays full of racks and boxes. It's like going through, I don't know.
If you've seen Indiana Jones with the big shelves where,
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
the warehouse,
Yes.
the big warehouse, that's what it's like.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's natural, I guess it's natural climate control down there, right?
Yeah. It's about 40% humidity all the time, 68 degrees year round. Never changes.
Yep.
With all the explosions that were going on years ago because of the gas leakage, how
Right.
was all that kept out of the area where all the storage happens?
Yeah, and I was working at the mine at the time,
Where
and
Stratica takes people for tours.
yeah, there was never any gas in the mine at all. We monitored for gas all the time, and we still do. Both Stratica does and the mine does, but all kinds of gases, not just methane, but also carbon dioxide, oxygen, all that stuff gets monitored constantly. And the route of travel of that gas leak from western Hutchinson, western Reno County across Hutchinson was a very narrow area, and the geologists, the area under Hutchinson is some of the most studied area in Kansas, and the geologists determined that what they think happened was it followed what they call a sand lens, or a riverbed that went through at that time. And so it was sand. And so that gas was able to go through that sand. And wherever there was an old brine well, and there was a lot of them in Hutch, that would come up as a water geyser. And it was all above the salt. It wasn't below the salt, because salt is impenetrable to gas. It's self-sealing and gas can't get through it. And so to go down and come into the mine wouldn't be a possibility, but we were afraid that it might get into the shaft, because the original shaft at Hutchinson Salt is wood. It's concrete through the water table, but then it's wood from the rest of the way down. So about 500 feet of wooden shaft. And so we're a little worried about that, but it didn't. It got really close. It got to that trailer park on East 4th. And that's where the Solvay soda ash plant was, and that's why there was brine wells there, and it came up through there. That's all. It's all been pumped out. There is no more gas. So, any other questions?
Yeah, that's I don't suppose there were still mules when you started working in the.
There were never any mules at this mine.
Oh, okay.
This was a modern mine. It was electric.
Right. Well, that's good. Good for the mules.
They were at Lyons and Canopolis, though. All the other mines had mules, but not. This mine was actually a very late starter. It was opened in 1923. All the other mines were opened in the 1890s.
Wow. And I wonder, I mean, and the reason that these are there is because of the ancient ocean over it, right?
It's a salt deposit from an ancient ocean. They think. They don't know 100%.
No.
We hosted, it's been 2 or 3 years ago, we hosted a geology convention where they actually talked about that salt bed, and they've made some discoveries looking at the salt. They see these chevrons in it that tell them how it grew. And there's a lot of debate on how this salt bed was laid down. Some think that the ancient ocean theory doesn't hold water very well.
No pun intended.
Yeah, well, maybe it was. But others think that the salt actually became so strong that it just deposited on the ocean floor, kind of like what's going on at the Great Salt Lake and Bonneville, which they were also, oceans at one time. So there's a lot of debate on how it actually got laid down, but it's definitely. I mean, when you go down there, you look at it, you see the strata, white and dark, and it looks like it was laid down by water. I mean, it just looks that way.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll go ahead and sign us off now. Thanks again, Myron and Lynn and everybody for coming. And look forward to. Oh, I forgot. Next month our local program is it's going to be about Frank Lloyd Wright, actually, and the Wright House in Wichita. So that should be an interesting one. I hope you all can join us for that. All right. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.
You guys have a good one too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.